Hey, everybody. I am Christiana Limniadis, and there we go. I'm Christiana Limniadis, and I am Program and Outreach Manager here at Preservation Maryland. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For Landmarking Basics. As I'm sure you're aware, this is our second lecture in our 2025 Historic Preservation Workshop Series with the Talbot Historical Society. We had our first lecture back on January, Preservation Basics. That is available on our YouTube channel, that little computer graphic there on the right hand side. So you can head over to YouTube and watch that if you didn't get to join us for that program. And then hopefully we'll be able to see you on March 22nd for our third and final lecture. That will be in person at the Talbot Historical Society, and we'll be talking about how to research your historic property. But again, thank you for joining us tonight at Landmarking Basics. We are here in this webinar room. We're going to have a crash course on landmarking. We're going to talk about a lot of different things, and I definitely want to answer your questions. So if you're here in the room right now, any questions that you have as they pop into your head, put them in that Q&A box, and we'll be able to tackle those at the end during the Q&A section. For those who are new to Preservation Maryland, we are your statewide historic preservation organization. We are here working to harness the power of our historic places and also to build the historic trades workforce. We were started in 1931. We're one of the oldest statewide organizations in the United States. So very proud of that and very proud to serve all of you here in the state of Maryland. Head over to our website, www.preservationmaryland.org, to sign up for our newsletter, follow us on social media, and you can see all the different projects that we're working on. So for tonight's agenda, we're going to first go through evaluating eligibility, talk about those terms and processes and policies that regulate and help us figure out if things are eligible for landmarking, for designation. And then we're going to look a little bit deeper at the National Register of Historic Places, what that is and how you get in it. And then similarly for local level landmarking. For those that have just recently joined in the last slide or two, I want to answer your questions. Please make sure to put those in the Q&A box as soon as they pop into your head, and we'll answer all of them at the end. All right, so evaluating eligibility. Before we can get into that nitty gritty, we just need to be clear that we're all on the same page about what we're talking about and what things we're dealing with, right? When we talk about historic preservation, 99% of the time we're talking about buildings just because they are the largest type of resource that we deal with, in number and quantity. But historic preservation planning, policies, procedures, landmarking, the whole entire shebang, all of it is written for resource preservation, and resources can be buildings, they can be structures, objects, sites, whether they are natural or man-made. And then historic districts individually are a resource, that district, which is then comprised of many individual resources. Very meta Q Inception theme on that one. But again, tonight I'm going to kind of interchangeably use the word building and resource, but everything that we talk about tonight is applicable to all of these types of resources. So evaluating eligibility, we're talking about designations, right? Landmarking things. That is a formal recognition of that resource as historic, as capital H historic. That does not mean, that capital H does not mean that it's more historic than other things, or that it's more special than other things, or that it has some sort of unattainable factor than other historic resources. It just simply means that we've formally designated it as historic. We've gone through that process. So it's a capital H historic building resource. When we are going through that designation process, that landmarking process, these are three of the terms, of the words, of the concepts that you are going to be hearing a lot about and that you're going to have to deal with through that process. Now, for majority of you, you are not the one that's going to be actually physically doing this project. You're most likely hire a consultant who will explain and shepherd you through this process. But certainly as a client, you want to do your best job and be the best client that you can. So a better understanding of what it is that you're consultant is doing is certainly going to help you. So the first three terms that we're going to talk about are criteria, significance, and integrity. Criteria is pretty straightforward. It's those principles and standards to evaluate historic resources. So every designation process, no matter what level or a level of government they exist at, are all going to have their own, or should have their own set of criteria that says if you want to be our type of landmark, you have to meet one or more of these principles or standards. Significance. This is that who, what, where, when of the history of your resource, the role that that resource has, the who, what, where, when of that resource, so the history of that resource, but not just the individual site or the campus or the historic district, like what happened there, or the people that were historic that were there, whatever that significance is individually, but making sure that you're tying that back up to a broad pattern of history, to the broad patterns of history. We don't exist in a bubble. And we have had European colonization on this land for over 400 years. So there's lots of places that have history, that things have happened at. But we want to take that localized significance and connect it into that broader timeline, into that shared context. And then integrity. Integrity is the authenticity of a property's historic identity. It's the ability of a property to convey its historic associations or attributions. So this is when we're talking at the actual physicality of this resource. Do those historic elements survive, and do they relate to the significance of that resource? We're going to talk about integrity a little bit more, but before we can kind of deep dive into integrity, we need to talk about one more term, and that's character defining features. This is a humongous concept and part of historic preservation planning, and is definitely something that's going to be you're going to encounter when you're evaluating a resource. So the character defining features are all those visual aspects and physical features that comprise the appearance of every historic building, but not just the visual appearance in that we're not just talking about the decorative doodads. We're not just talking about the pretty stones or the turned balustrades and all of the swag that might be on a building. We are also talking about the form and function of that building. Every aspect of that structure, of that resource, together makes that resource and defines that resource. When we talk about exterior character defining features, it is easy to kind of pinpoint those things. We can see a little chart here pointing at a building. All of those things would be considered character defining features, but also the form and the massing, the fact that it's a two-room, this picture that we see here on the screen, it gives the impression that it has two rooms. It's 2 rooms wide and at least 2 or 3 rooms deep. It has a particular pitch to its roof. All of those things go together to become character defining features. Someone like me who has had significant training in how not only to identify character defining features, but how they collect together and how to identify things by those character defining features, could just look at a picture of a building and be able to identify those things and be able to give you rough estimates of when it was constructed, what style it is, and even where it was constructed. To help us through figuring out what character defining features are, the National Park Service has a couple of really great guides. There's a thing called preservation briefs, and number 17 is all about identifying character. That's what you see on the left-hand side there. And then that little colored box, that walk through historic buildings, is this really fun website from the National Park Service. It's kind of like Intranet 1995-ish, and it's an interactive clickable game where you can learn about character defining features and then check your skills if you can identify character defining features. So as we define and look at these character defining features, those are the things that we're going to be evaluating for integrity. So like we said, integrity is that authenticity of the physical resource to its significance. And helping us to evaluate integrity, the National Park Service has identified 7 areas of integrity. These are the 7 areas of a resource to analyze and to evaluate. And then together, if it has sufficient integrity in at least 4 of these areas, it would be deemed to have integrity, enough integrity for land marking. National Park Service created this for the federal program only. They made it for use through the National Register program and other federal programs. But as time has gone on and we have more and more local level, state and local level preservation planning activities, this standard, this idea of integrity and the evaluation of integrity has permeated through all the levels. So while it might not be point blank mentioned maybe in certain state or local documents, it is certainly implied that we need to have a level of integrity, and this is how we evaluate these. Just quickly going through what these words mean. Location, pretty straightforward. It's the place the building is at. Has it been moved? Has it always been in this space? Its setting is not necessarily, zeroing in on that location. Is it always been set in the same way? Was it built on the street side, or has it been moved backwards in its lot? Has it been twisted and turned? Not just that individual resource, but the setting around it. Was it originally surrounded by open farmland and now there's houses 3 inches away? So that general placing of that building in that location. Design, materials, workmanship, pretty straightforward as from their name, the design, the actual design of the building, engineering, the elements that create that form and plan and space and structure, the materials used on the building. Was it originally a wood? Did it have stone? Did it have terracotta? Are those materials still there? Workmanship, that artistic touch on those resources, is that still present? Is there evidence of that artisan's labor and skill in creating those things? And then feeling and association are bolded and italicized on purpose because they're a little bit more wiggly, whereas the first 5 areas to some degree can be quantitative. We can compare visual evidence of here's this location from before, here's the location after. We can count the pieces of original material. We can kind of quantify and have firm data for those. Feeling and association is very much kind of wiggly and a little bit more of a personal opinion, but still grounded in that data. So feeling relates to a property's expression of its aesthetic or historic sense of a period of time. So for example, if you have you are proposing to create a rural historic district, if it retains its original setting, its original design, materials, and workmanship, then it would retain that feeling of being an agricultural area, right? So again, it's relying on those other qualities as well. And then association is, that direct link between the historic event, the historic person, whatever that historic significance is, and the resource today. My favorite example for association is a train depot. So if you have a train depot and it could be in perfect integrity, everything of that building is same, but it's not a functioning train depot anymore. So does that vacant train depot still have an association with its original use? What if the train tracks have been removed and it's just this random train depot, and now visually it's just kind of like a random train depot in the middle of a lawn? It's lost its association to that thing. That doesn't mean that it can't have high integrity in the other areas, certainly. So that's why those feelings and association are kind of wiggly. And then also with integrity, we have to make sure that we are not confusing it with condition. When we are evaluating integrity, it is the character defining features that relate to the significance that survive. We don't care about condition. We can fix and repair or even replace in kind those character defining features. But if they are removed, if they're gone, we have nothing to preserve on that building. So we have 2 examples here on the left-hand side. I did not pick buildings from Maryland. I didn't want to embarrass anybody. These are from out of state. These are from New York State. And so we can see 2 vastly different buildings. The top building, it's a small picture, but it's missing windows. It has a door boarded up. It's overgrown landscaping. I think you can see the original roof cladding coming through the holes. And then on the bottom, you have a nice, clean, normal kind of street house. We look at the top one, and when we apply these areas of integrity to it, it retains exceptional integrity. It is a dilapidated, falling down house, but it retains almost every single character defining feature that helps define this type of building in this time period in this location. Whereas the bottom image, beautiful, well-maintained home, but it has lost nearly all of its integrity, all of the design, materials, workmanship that would help you identify this as the Victorian era home that it is, are totally gone. So the top one has high integrity, the bottom one has absolutely zero integrity, or maybe like 2 degrees of integrity. So crash course in that evaluation of integrity, it's taking these things and kind of smushing them together and kind of seahorse or seesaw kind of evaluating them. Is the integrity good or bad? Is it enough to make up to connect to the significance? Is the significance so much that maybe we can be okay with a little bit less integrity, or maybe it's so much that we need to have more integrity? It's very much a balancing game, but you're going to take the character defining features, that significance, and the integrity, evaluate those together and apply them to the criteria to see, do I meet these criteria? Again, this is like crash course on how to do this. This is an entire class in grad school, if not multiple classes. So very top level explanation of this, but these are going to be those key things that you need to keep in mind as you're evaluating a resource for potential eligibility. Okay, that's evaluating eligibility. Now we are going to move on to the National Register of Historic Places. We're going to talk more about that. But some of you might not know about what the National Register is or how it fits into the broader scheme of designation. So let's just take a step back for a second. For all intents and purposes, there are 4 different types of landmarking. There are 4 different levels of landmarking. Just because they are levels, just because they appear to be hierarchical, does not mean that they have to happen in this order. Doesn't mean that they have to happen together. You don't have to have all of them. You could have only one of them. There's a lot of flexibility in this, but these are the 4 types that exist. So we have the National Historic Landmark Program. That is the tippy top of the pyramid, I guess. This level is kind of reserved for particular types of resources. This one is reserved for those that have the most kind of significant impact on our national history. If that resource had not existed or it happened in a different way, the course of American history would be different. There are only about 25 or 2,600 NHLs is what we call them, NHLs, National Historic Landmarks. We're not going to talk about them tonight. It's such an elite group of resources that can be considered for that. I've been in the field for 20 years now. I've never participated in an NHL nomination. So it's really just something reserved for NPS people and consultants. So we're just not going to talk about it tonight. The Preservation Basics lecture that was recorded back in January and available on our YouTube, I do talk a little bit more about the National Historic Landmark Program and what it is and how it works. National Register of Historic Places. You can call it the NR, you can call it the NRHP, you can call it the National Register, you can call it the Register. All of those names are appropriate. The one that is not is Registry. Please do me a favor, if you like me, please do not call it Registry. Thank you. We are going to talk about that. So we'll put a pin in that for now and move on. We're going to come back. Maryland Register of Historic Places. There is a state register of historic places here. Most states have a state register, if not all of them. But like most states, Maryland has incorporated that state register process and review and nomination into the National Register nomination process. So there is no separate thing that you have to do to get onto the state register. It's part of that normal process. So for tonight, we're not going to talk about it because there's nothing to say that's different than what you would have to do to get into the National Register. And then we have local level landmarking. This is when your local municipality, your city, town, village, or your county has passed a preservation ordinance allowing for landmarking process. And we are going to talk about that. But before we can talk about the end designation, that's the last step, right? That's the end goal of preservation planning. The beginning of preservation planning is documentation, is research, is doing the survey. Most nominations are going to come from what's called a historic resource survey or a cultural resource survey, HRSs or CRSs. I'm a little bit old school. We were always taught to call them historic resource surveys. Now, in the modern preservation era, I think we're leaning more towards cultural resource survey, but it really doesn't matter. And there's also something called cultural landscape reports. Basically, very similar type of document, similar survey report, but instead of necessarily looking at built environment and neighborhoods and buildings that you would in an HRS, cultural landscapes are looking at landscapes, natural and man-made, where the majority of it is not built upon. No matter what the survey is, we want to start with that documentation. We want to start with that survey. It's going to give us the recommendations that will lead us to creating our designations. So historic resource surveys, they identify historic resources. The surveys identify historic resources. You've identified your geographic area that you're going to survey. It's going to identify all the historic resources that are existing in that area, survey area. It's going to determine the historic context for that area. So it's going to detail the history of it, the key moments and timelines and people and build and resources, and then tying that to the development history. So it's not just, a flowy, lovely history of the people and times. You're connecting that timeline and history to the evolution and changes of those resources and the development of those resources. So it's a really kind of holistic, complete narrative of what the history of that area is. And then in that recommendation section, it's going to establish priorities for future projects, right? It's going to say through this survey, we found X number of resources that we think are eligible for landmarking right now. You could go start working on the nomination. Or it might say through this research survey project, we have a lot more questions about certain things and we recommend doing more survey work on X, Y, and Z. So it's going to give you kind of that roadmap of preservation planning tasks for that survey area. And then good surveys, and specifically intensive level surveys, are going to include inventories of all of those historic resources. Again, that's going to visually look different depending on the time period that the survey was made. Now we're using, spreadsheets and iPad, tablets, and doing things very, very digitally. Back in the day, we'd have to go around and take pictures and write an individual form for each and every building. So again, depending on when your survey project, if you're looking at one, when it was made, or if you're making it now, that's going to look a little bit different. Throughout this whole entire process, there are guides from both the National Park Service and MHT, Maryland Historical Trust, that help guide how to do surveys. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the cover for National Register Bulletin number 24, which is the guidelines for local surveys and the basics of preservation planning, the basis of preservation planning. So that is, it looks a little ancient, but that is still the valid guide of how we do survey work. And then MHT has their own standards and guidelines for architectural and historical investigations. And when I say their own, I don't mean that they're different. They are totally incorporating all of these national standards. It's just using Maryland examples and giving you the Maryland procedure of how to communicate with MHT. Incredible resources to use. Okay, so back to designations. You've done your survey work, you've got your recommendations, you're ready to go make that thing a landmark. Let's talk about the National Register. So the National Register is the federal government's official listing of resources deemed worthy for preservation for their historic context, or historic significance, excuse me. A very simple descriptor that says so much, right? So it's our listing of historic significance, but it's worthy of preservation. Why would it be worthy of preservation? That is the integrity aspect of this. So we have our historic significance. This place is important for X, Y, and Z, but if it doesn't have integrity, if there are not enough sufficient character-defining features and elements surviving on that resource that connect and support and confirm that significance, then there's nothing left that's worthy of preserving on that building. the National Register isn't a listing of all of our historic places purely. It's our places that are worthy of preservation, meaning they have integrity to that significance. It is enabled by the National Historic Preservation Act back in 1966. It is honorary only. There is no regulatory process tied to the National Register of Historic Places. You can get listed on the National Register today and tomorrow with your own money, and as long as you're in accordance with all local laws related to permitting, you could demolish that building and the federal government can't do anything to you. The federal government cannot tell you what to do with your National Register listed building unless you are going to the federal government asking them for money or permits, right? Then they'll say, hey, if we're going to give you this money, this grant, this tax credit, or other sort of financial incentive, then we want you to do good preservation. We want to follow these standards and guidelines. But if that's not happening, there is no teeth to this ordinance. That's why it's so important, however prestigious it sounds, that it's listed on the National Register, and it is such a great honor. It does not save a building. So very important to understand. National Register status only does not save a building. Now, all that said, there are some communities, several communities in Maryland, who in their local landmarking law created in the eligibility requirements for their preservation ordinance include National Register status. So there are communities that say that if it's been listed in the National Register, then it is considered a local level landmark. And in that instance, yes, then that building will have regulation applied to it, but it is not the federal government doing that regulation. It is your local government that's doing that, that's electing to create that eligibility requirement and that criteria. But the feds can't do anything to you. As I said, it's a gateway to money, historic tax credits, a variety of different grant programs. Many different financial incentive programs use National Register eligibility or listing as a criteria. It's an important land use tool. We just talked about survey work. We do, tons of studies on our roadways and our waterways before we change them, but we kind of tear down buildings without second thought. So by doing that survey work, whether you do a National Register nomination or not, you're getting all of this data to be able to figure out what's going on with your community. And then lastly, it does require owner approval. While there is no regulatory aspect to this, there is no teeth to this ordinance, to this policy, this program. Because it is an act of the federal government, they have to have owner approval. So that means if you're listing your individual building, you, the owner, would need to say yes. If it's a historic district, then the overwhelming response that they get, the majority of the responses that they get from the homeowners has to be positive. They're not going to knock on everybody's door and say, vote yes or no. That's not how it works. It's just if the overwhelming consensus is yes, then they'll do it. If the overwhelming consensus is no, they won't. We talked about criteria, right? So the National Register has their own criteria. There are 4 criteria. You have to meet one or more of them to be deemed eligible for the National Register. Criteria A is about events. So association with events that have made that significant contribution to the broad pattern of history. That's super, keep that in mind. It's not just about you and your bubble of your building or your campus or whatever. It's how your little bubble floated along everybody else's bubbles in tandem through history. Criterion B, it's about the people, right? So you have a significant individual that lived or bought or was in your house, whatever. Criteria C, this is all about the architecture, design, engineering. It's that the building is being nominated for itself, not because of the people or events associated with it. And then criterion D is about prehistory and archaeology, whether it's been discovered or documentation implies that these resources are within that. So criterion D is going to be for all of that. Again, you have to meet one or more of these. Something that's kind of a trend and something that's kind of happening now in the field that we're working through collectively is that over the last however many years, maybe since the beginning, we have really relied on criterion C. And a lot of different states and national park reviewers have really, leaned in on that maybe a little too hard. and that there's a lot of resources that maybe didn't have the best architecture or integrity, but had strong other criteria, might not have gotten through as easy or as successfully. So there is really a great push going right now at the state and national levels to make sure that we are really focusing on criterion A, B, and D, that it's not just about pretty buildings or that stuff. Those are great and we still need to nominate those. But there's lots of places that are totally significant and eligible that are just criterion A, B, or D. And so that's what we want to make sure that we're doing, that we're making sure that we're having spreading the love on the significance. Like I said before, there are tons of guides and resources to help you through your preservation adventure, whatever that preservation adventure is. Here, for evaluating criteria for the National Register, there are dozens of things that the National Park Service has issued to help you. The big thing is this red covered thing on the left-hand side, National Register Bulletin, what number is it? 14, 15, 16, something like that. They don't put the number on this one for some reason. It's the National Register criteria for evaluation. So this book is literally, each page is criterion A, criterion B, criterion C, and they break it down for you and explain how to meet that. What does it mean to meet that criterion? And gives you great examples. Again, it looks old. It's from the 90s. That's when we established this criteria for evaluation. Before that, it was a little bit more fluid and loosey-goosey, but this was created in the mid-90s, I think it is. But there's so many different types of historic resources out there, right? And even though these criteria for evaluation is applicable to every resource, some of them are a little bit more complicated and have a little bit more nuance or other situations that need to be taken into consideration. So because of that, the National Park Service has made dozens of other bulletins that zero in on specific types of resources and gives you better examples to make that connection. So here on the screen, you can see one for traditional cultural places, one for resources that are younger than 50 years old. 50 years is kind of that general marker that we like to use. If it's younger than 50, it can still be nominated. We just got to use these criteria evaluations to help us make sure we're making that decision correctly. There's evaluation criteria for archaeology properties, and then for significant persons. Again, just getting a little bit more into the meat and details than what's in that red covered document. My biggest claim to fame in my career used to be that I had an actual physical copy of the criteria for evaluation, the red covered one. And then I had an intern a million years ago steal it from me, and it was the saddest day of my life. Okay, National Register, the actual nomination process. So you've worked with your consultant, you know you want to nominate this building. What is that going to look like? So the first step on this adventure towards National Register listing is going to be your Maryland Inventory of Historic Places form and your determination of eligibility. As far as Maryland is concerned, these things are two different documents, but they are essentially the same thing. The information that you're going to include on your MIHP form and on your determination of eligibility form are going to be the same. It provides the preliminary historical and architectural history of the resource. It provides an analysis of the integrity of that property as it relates to that history. And you make your argument for how the resource meets the criteria, taking those things into account. MHT staff is going to work with you through that process. None of this is done all alone. There is hand-holding available on multiple levels throughout all of this. So once you do that MIHP form, the DOE form, you submit that to Maryland Historical Trust, to MHT. As long as they agree with you, they're going to review it. And if they agree with you, they're going to confer that there is a positive, a favorable determination of eligibility, and they'll issue a kind of a confirmation of that in their system, that yes, we agree with this historic narrative and what you've put forth in your form, that is the history of the building and that it meets whatever criteria you've argued for. Once you get that, then you can move on to the next step. Sometimes MHT might have questions and want you to include more information, or maybe they feel that some of the information you put in there is actually not relevant to this resource and that they want to clarify some things. So there might be a back and forth in editing. That's perfectly normal. But once you secure that favorable DOE, then you can move on to actually writing the nomination. You're going to work with MHT. You can work with nonprofits like us. You can hire someone to do it for you. Lots of different ways to get help. But then you'll go into that nomination drafting period. The National Park Service estimates that it takes a minimum of 60 to 100 hours for an individual or small nomination. So it's like equally terrifying and not that bad. I mean, a 40-hour work week, if you have a really tiny house, a tiny building, and it's not that huge of a history, that could happen. But certainly for a more complex resource, it'll take more research. When we're looking at historic districts, minimum 200 hours, minimum. I mean, depending on how big that the historic district is, certainly. But again, you're going to work through the guidelines on that. You're going to work with MHT staff. They're going to provide you feedback. It's going to be great. Once the nomination draft is completed, then it'll go through that final review with MHT staff. And if they're okay with it and they think that it is a successful nomination, then they will pass it on to the GCC. I love saying that. The GCC is our state review board. Every other state just calls it a state review board, but we're Maryland and we're cooler. So we are going to call it the Governor's Consulting Committee on the National Register of Historic Places. So it goes to the GCC. They meet 3 times a year, I think. And they review it. The staff presents it to them. They ask any questions that they might have. And if they feel that it successfully meets the criteria, then it'll get added to the state register, and then they'll forward that application onward to the National Park Service. And then once it gets to the National Park Service, our amazing federal employees who dedicate themselves to the National Park Service and defending our Constitution will look through that document and either confer and agree that it does successfully meet the National Register standards or evaluation eligibility requirements, and we'll put it into the list it in the National Register. They might come back with some questions. They might say that certain areas need to be improved, or they want more information or whatnot. I've definitely been a part of that, where my state was totally cool with the nomination, but then the National Park Service had some questions. Completely normal and part of the process. But whatever goes through on the National Park Service, once they finally get to the place where they're good with it, then it gets approved, and the keeper of the National Register, that is their official title, the keeper of the register, will list it in the National Register. And according to federal statutes, NPS has to provide a decision on a National Register nomination within 45 days. But of course, if they have questions or there's conversation about that nomination, then that timeline gets put on hold. But they have to write to you. They have to say something within 45 days. The National Park Service recently, as of, I think it was 2023, I want to say, maybe even earlier than that, but this is the new National Register form. This is the first 2 pages of it. So when you're working on new ones, this is what it's going to look like. This is from, what county is this from? This is from Charles County. There hasn't been a recent nomination in Talbot. So I don't have an example for you guys of this form, but this is what it looks like. All the forms are the same. All the questions are the same. All the information we're putting on this are the same from, the mid-90s when those criterias were established. What the change is literally just font and formatting. So this one is very spaced out, and it's a Word document. The previous form is this one, and you've probably seen this form. The vast majority of our National Register nominations or on this paperwork. It's a lot more condensed. I like this one better. And this one is for Old Bloomfield, the first 2 pages for Old Bloomfield, which is in Easton. It was listed in the National Register in 1980. This is, again, an earlier nomination. The criteria for evaluation wasn't established. Those criteria A, B, C, and D, that wasn't established until the mid-90s. And so with the establishment of that is when, certain questions and things on the form were created. This is from before. So there's not really going to be a mention to a criteria. They mention just the area of study that's important. So this one was listed as an example of its type of architecture. It's a very thin nomination. This is definitely one that I would recommend would need an update. It's very thin. If this nomination was written today, it would not be, I think this one is like 5 pages long. I think this nomination, if written today, would easily be at least 20, 25 pages long. All right, so let's talk about what is actually in that nomination form. Sorry. So here's the first 2 pages that you can see, but what's the rest of it going to be? So the general parts of a nomination is the nomination form itself. So there's going to be, let me just go back one more time, sorry. So the first page of the form is just fill in the blank, the name of the resource, the location, what type of resource it is. There's some fill in the blank questions about materials, who you are, who the owner is, all that stuff. So that's what I mean by nomination form. It's kind of just those fill in the blank questions that you have to answer. Then there is a section 7. It is a narrative description of your resource. There is section 8, which is a narrative statement of significance. And those are capital S's. That's the title of that type of a document, a historic context kind of statement of significance. Then there's a bibliography and a boundary description. We're not going to talk about the boundary description of the bibliography. It's pretty straightforward and detailed and explained in bulletin number 16. That is how to complete the National Register form. We're going to talk about section 7 and section 8, which are those narrative sections, the paragraphs that you're going to have to write. To this National Register bulletin of how to fill in the form, this booklet is very similar to kind of those schedule explanations that you get when you're doing your taxes, or back in the day when you would do your taxes on paper. If you had different forms that you needed to do, there'd be an accompanying instruction sheet, and it would literally be each question in order. What is this question asking you? How do you answer that? And that's how this National Register bulletin is. It literally goes question by question, explains what that is and how you're supposed to answer it. So let's talk about section 7 and section 8, the narrative things that you're going to have to put together. Sorry, one second. So when we talk about section 7 and any of the narrative sections that you're going to write in your National Register nomination, it is all about starting broad and zeroing in and getting more specific as you go along. So when we talk about your narrative description, your section 7, you're going to start it off with a summary, an introduction, a summary paragraph that in a very as brief as you can gives you the big points of what that resource is and why it's important. On the right-hand side, you'll see the first page of the section 7 for the St. Michael's Historic District. So for historic districts, it gets a little bit weirder. Certainly, it's not going to be a nice, clean paragraph like you could write a clean paragraph about an individual building. But here, it just basically gives you that summary of what is St. Michael's. Here's the big picture. Here's where we are. And it gets more and more specific as it goes on. So you have your summary paragraph that describes the building or the, whatever the resource is. You want to start with your location, setting, form, and massing. The outside, you want to start by talking from the top to the bottom. Then you're going to go inside, describe the general plan of your building. Is it 2 stories, 1 story? How many rooms deep? And then you'll get, what's the molding situation? What is there plaster? Then you get more and more specific. Interior plans, details. And then as part of your section 7 for a historic district, that is going to be your inventory. It is going to be literally a list of every single resource, every address, every tax parcel, whatever word we're using to define those units, an inventory of all of them. So it'll have their address, location, whatever that descriptor is, the name of it. It'll have an assessment of integrity, whether, especially in an intensive level survey or nomination, it'll have, if it's a contributing resource or a non-contributing resource, but it'll have a lot of data on those individual resources. Again, depending on what you're nominating, this could be a couple pages long. It could be hundreds of pages long. One of the largest historic districts that exists in the country is about 5,000 buildings. And that section 7, I think, is 300 pages long. because it's the description of that neighborhood and then that inventory list. Shifting to section 8, this is our narrative description of the history. We just wrote the architecture, now we're having the history, and we want that similar upside down triangle. We want to start with the big picture and placing where this resource is in time and space, and then zeroing in on its significance. Similarly with the section 7, you're going to start with kind of a literal statement of significance. There is a nice little format of how most consultants will have, their own little cheat sheet of how they structure this sentence for them. But you want, it's your elevator speech of why this thing is historic and why it's important and what criteria it meets. So if you're saying that a property, a resource is important because it was an early, building in your community, how can we evaluate that it's important as an early building in your community if we don't have the history of your community, right? So we want to kind of have that background, that history, that greater community. What are we looking in and zeroing in? As you're writing this section 8, you also want to make sure that you're connecting the dots of the significance. We want to be obvious. We might, in explaining that this, building was important, it's obviously implied that it was a vital landmark for the community. It was used by the community or whatever. Say that. Say the obvious thing out loud. Connecting the dots is really important. You don't know who's going to read this in the future, right? This isn't just in an echo chamber kind of thing. You're not just writing it so that the reviewer can look at it and then it gets put on a shelf. This is now a regulatory document moving forward. This is now a research document moving forward. Some researcher in the future is going to pick this up to either do more research on this document and this resource and do even more preservation planning things, or it could be the jumping off point for a different research topic. So we need to be thinking of anybody who could be reading this in the future. And things that might be obvious to you right now may not be obvious to that person reading it later. So connect those dots, be really clear. You might think you're being dumb, but it's not dumb. Spell everything out. And as you're doing this section 7 narrative, yes, we want the history and the timeline and the social and cultural history related to this resource. But we want to make sure that as we're giving that timeline, that we're connecting the dots to the development and major changes of this building. So there might have been a time where it was originally built, 1 story, 1 room, and then it got added to as the time went on. Why did those things happen, right? Your cultural and social history will probably tell you why the kitchen got added in 1835, because they had a baby. I don't know. So you want to connect the culture and the history to the physical place. You want to make sure you're making those connections. And then again, you're ending this narrative with your argument of the significance and integrity, that you're saying that based on the significance, it has a high level of integrity for X, Y, and Z. It might have a low level of integrity, but you're going to explain why it has a low level of integrity and why you're still doing this nomination. So you're going to make that argument there. And then you tie it all up with another kind of similar statement of significance, this summary paragraph that pulls it all together and says it's important for X, Y, and Z, and it meets this criteria. Quickly, let's talk about some of the resources that are NR listed in Talbot. I'm going to break my rule and just look at this one question that came in, because the question is, what properties in Talbot are currently already on the National Register? I have to say, you guys don't have that many. You have a couple of historic districts that include a lot of resources, certainly, but definitely would love, maybe in our March session, we can have a robust conversation about the places that probably could use some National Register listing or updates to their National Register listing. But let's just quickly talk about 3 of them. First is the Victorian Corn Cribs in Doncaster, listed in 1976. It was before the criteria, so it's not criteria A, B, or C. Clearly defined in the paperwork, it was nominated for its architecture and its agriculture. So that would be criterion C probably, and criterion A. It was moved, so that's a thing to keep in mind. And then also I put that logo there for the bicentennial, because just keep in mind when you're looking through old nominations and you see ones from that first generation, that the late 70s, the mid 70s, those are all bicentennial projects. Those are all part of our big push to commemorate and document our history. I moved my mouse. The Landolph House in Easton, this was listed in 2002 under Criterion C as a fine example of Queen Anne and shingle styles. And then what you guys do have a lot of in Talbot County, which is so fun, is all of these log racing canoes. Or racing log canoes, excuse me, are listed on the National Register. They are resources. They are eligible for the National Register. And this one, Magic, I picked it by its name, is part of a group of 22, the last surviving racing log canoes. And so this one was listed in 1980 with the rest of them. It was built in 1894. I spelled governors wrong, but it won the Governor's Cup in 1927. And it is one of the older surviving of the racing log canoes. Okay, crash course in the National Register. Let's take a look at local landmarking in Talbot County. I mean, most of this applies to everybody, but then we'll zero in on one of the landmarking processes in the county. So local level landmarking, it is the most effective way to protect historic resources. This is where we get teeth in our landmarking. Pardon me. To be able to locally landmark, you have to have a preservation ordinance, a preservation law passed by your legislative body, your town hall, your town board, city council, county commissioners, whatever that is. They have to pass a law allowing for this preservation ordinance. There's laws at the state level that enable and give your municipality the ability and power to do that. It's also supported by decades and decades of case law. The reason that this is the most effective way to protect a historic resource is because it is honorary and regulatory. 90% of preservation ordinances create the designation process for the point of regulating those exterior, most likely exterior changes to that historic resource. It's saying we value these things in our community. We want to celebrate and honor them, and we want to make sure that we're taking steps to preserve those things into future. Again, please make sure to go look at our Preservation Basics lecture on the YouTube. I go into much more detail on how this impacts property owners and how that works. We're not going to get into that much tonight, obviously. And then similarly with the National Register, it might be a gateway to money. It just depends on what your landmarking is and all of that jazz. It could open the door to historic tax credits. If you have local tax credits, it could also open the door to some state tax credits, not all historic tax credits. It's an important land use tool, just like with National Register. And depending on how the law is written, it might require owner approval. My opinion and how I have always been presented in my career is that best practices suggest that owner approval should not be part of the process. But there are many, many communities in Maryland that have that as a requirement. Talbot County, we have 3 different landmarking opportunities. There is a Talbot County preservation ordinance. So there is a landmarking at the county level. And then also Port of Oxford and Easton have passed their own preservation ordinances to landmark and regulate historic resources. So if you're in those 2 communities, you're going to go to your local preservation staff people and your municipality to talk through those processes. If you're anywhere else in the county and interested in landmarking, you're going to talk to the county about that. We're going to zero in on Easton. Talbot Historical Society is located there, so we're just going to pick Easton to go with. It's in the code, it's chapter 28 in zoning, article 6, historic district. In the law, it details everything it has to do with this program, right? It lays out the mission, the purpose, it lays out the membership, everything that has to do with that historic district commission of who they are and what they do and how they do it is in there. Easton has also created lots of other documents and guidelines to help you through those different processes as well. They have staff that can help you through that. In that ordinance, it established 2 historic districts, the Meeting House District and the Old Easton District, and then also several individual landmarks, but it also obviously allows for the opportunity to create new ones. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting and where there's definitely room for more and better supportive preservation planning. The ordinance says that we can landmark new things, but it doesn't really include any specifics in the law to further guide that process. What it says is that, quote, after making full and proper study, the Historic District Commission can recommend landmarks to the town, to get approved and designated by the mayor and town council. It also says that new resources listed in the National Register or included in the Maryland Historical Trust system can also be evaluated as a landmark in Talbot County. So either course of the action, but the only details we get in the law is that it's full and proper study. So there's no real mention of criteria that you have to meet. There's no real mention of what the documents have to look like. It's just full and proper study. Or if it's been listed in the other things, if it's been NR listed, it has an MIHP form with a positive determination, or it's been landmarked by Talbot County. So we're landmarking those things. We bring it to the HDC. They have in the law a process for how public hearings are supposed to go, and the review process part of it is sort of in there. But if they determine that it is a good, after making full and proper study, they feel that they are confident in recommending that landmark, then they'll send it up to the mayor and town council for final approval. So that's the general process that's detailed in their law. While they don't have more specific information about criteria or format of your landmarking, you should still be using the available standards and guidelines and best practices to create that. You don't necessarily need to do a full National Register nomination to list in Easton. I think that would be a little overkill and more time and work than necessary. But using the principles and policies and the general guidelines put forth in these documents is going to help you create a better document in the end. That will be, a better preservation planning resource into the future. Once you're landmarked in Easton, again, it's regulatory. So once you're a landmark in Easton, then you'll have to go through that Historic District Commission review to get a certificate of appropriateness for any exterior changes to that building. And Easton has a lot of great resources on their website to help property owners through that. So there's, different documents like the administrative rules that explain how the meetings physically work, flow charts to help you figure out what do you need to apply for, what you don't, and all that jazz. And then design guidelines that, get into even more details, helping you through that. Here is just the map of those historic districts and individual landmarks. This is from the design guidelines. Because it's from the design guidelines that were published in whatever year that was, I forget off the top of my head. So there might be some more newer landmarks since this map was produced, but here's just the general idea of the size of the historic district. Like I said before about how many things in Talbot County are landmarked, it's definitely a county that we could be landmarking much more of resources. But we do have some historic districts that are pretty large. I mean, I don't know how many buildings are on all of those blocks, but those are big areas, so that is a lot of geographic area to be contained in a historic district. And that is local landmark, just a snapshot at Easton. Again, there's not really a clear procedure and policy in there, so we just want to follow kind of that general guidance that the National Park Service gives us, and certainly communicate with your staff people at the town to make sure that you're following the way that they want. So with that, I want to, while anyone else has any other questions to put into the Q&A box, I want to do a little plug for our Heritage Fund grant program. It is open right now. It provides a max award of $10,000 for a wide variety of preservation projects, not just kind of those stereotypical brick and mortar projects, but also survey projects, research projects, planning and feasibility projects. A whole slew of things can be eligible for this grant program. So I definitely want to encourage you to check that out. Again, I am Christiana Limniadis. I am your program and outreach manager at Preservation Maryland. So please do not hesitate to reach out with any questions that you have about anything preservation, old building related. If there are no other questions, I'll keep it for another second to see if anyone else is typing. But with that, thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out with any preservation questions. And if you're watching this live right now in February, please, I encourage you to join us in March when we'll be at the Talbot Historical Society, learning how to do research and how to create those nomination documents. Thanks, guys. Have a great rest of your night.